Now, starting with agenda item 5, and this is related to the proposed draft guidance on food allergen labeling. This presentation is also supported by another document that I believe Pauline and colleagues from ILSI Southeast Asia region have shared with you yesterday. So we realize, I mean, you may not have had the time really to go through the entire document, but just to mention that you have a more thorough or a more complete analysis in these documents that were shared with you. Now, just maybe providing an update on the background of this item. Now, this item is introduced in the Codex step process. Right now, it is in fact sitting at step 3. So step 3 being the comment step. So essentially, there was some drafting, and then we reached a commenting stage. And of course, it will be discussed at the committee level at step 4. And if you recall, the background of this one goes back to CCFL 45. CCFL 45 agreed to review and clarify the provisions related to allergen labeling in the general standard for labeling of prepackaged foods. And particularly at the time when CCFL did this, it did it in the context where there was a recognition that Codex did not visit the issue of allergen labeling since basically the adoption of the amendment to the standard in 1998. So it was really timely to re-examine those provisions in the general standard for food labeling related to allergen labeling. And it was also happening at the same time when another committee, mainly CCFH, was looking at the way allergen management in the food industries is to be provided. And in fact, there was a code of practice that was developed by CCFH and was adopted by the Commission on allergen management. Now, what CCFL agreed to do is two things. The first thing was to recognize that the list of what is known as the priority allergens, this is not identified in the text as priority allergens, but basically the list of foods and ingredients that were listed in section 4.2.1.4 of the general standard for labeling of prepackaged foods, which is essentially the list, what we know as the big 8. People refer to those as the big 8, you know, the ingredients that warrant priority attention for labeling. So this list needed to be reviewed and revised. And at the same time, there was also an indication that there was another type of labeling that became pervasive since 1998, and that is worthy of a collective guidance through Codex, and that's the way precautionary allergen labeling is to be applied. And as you know, precautionary allergen labeling is those items that we call may contain or may be present, or all these statements that say manufactured in the same facility that processes, you know, allergen X, etc. And we've seen really a proliferation of these statements and really different regulatory requirements and sometimes lack of regulatory requirements around those. And basically Codex was asked through CCFL to provide such guidance. Now, of course, in order to provide such guidance, CCFL relied or needed some additional scientific advice. And this scientific advice was to be provided and was provided since then by an FAO-WHO expert consultation. Basically, this expert consultation was triggered with questions that were asked both by CCFL, but also by CCFH. And those questions were related to the following. First of all, expert advice was sought on reviewing the list of priority allergens, so the big 8, and whether they should remain as priority allergens. And in doing so, essentially, the scientific advice also sought guidance on the criteria that ought to be utilized in order to arrive at the conclusion that an ingredient should be a priority allergen and therefore should be mentioned in that section 4.2.1.4. There was also another question that was asked, and that is a question related to the thresholds of reaction. And this is really coming from the acknowledgement that allergic reactions are in fact threshold-driven reactions. And as a result, there is a need to have an indication of what would be those thresholds of concern that we need to perhaps identify, on the basis of which, again, risk management decisions could be made. So basically, this expert consultation looked at that, and in fact, 4 reports were produced by this expert group, and now, in fact, all those 4 reports were available. And an electronic working group was re-established. This electronic working group was chaired by Australia and co-chaired by the UK and the United States to continue the work. So where are we at in CCFL 47? What are we going to be doing? We are going to be examining the proposed changes to the general standard for labeling of prepackaged food, which is presented under Appendix 2 of the documents that were provided, which essentially contain some changes to the way allergen labeling is mentioned. Amongst other things, basically the names of those priority allergens, so the names of the ingredients and the foods that would be warranting the mandatory declaration. Also, the way the declaration is to be carried out. So essentially, the type of foods and the way the declaration is to be carried out. But also there's another discussion that will be happening, and that's essentially around a new proposed guideline. And that is not going to be discussed for the first time. This is going to be another iteration that is being discussed around the way precautionary allergen labeling is to be applied. So what we prepared here is in fact an analysis of those changes that are proposed, and really to trigger the discussion amongst us as to the type of comments that could be provided, hopefully to react to the to these proposed changes. The first point that I would like to mention here is now we have in fact a new proposed list of what we call the new Big 8. And what you will find is in fact that soy, for example, was removed from the Big 8, and we saw the introduction of sesame in the list. And in fact, the way this list was updated was based on 3 criteria. The first criteria is prevalence at the global level. The second criteria is the severity of the reaction that these food ingredients are likely to induce. And the third criterion is actually
Can you mute?
I'm trying to mute. There's one colleague who is not muted here, so
Can you do that?
I'm trying actually to yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. So I mentioned prevalence, severity, and the third criterion is potency. And potency is essentially basically the fact that you can have a very small dose that can induce a reaction in individuals. And when those criteria were applied, that's essentially where we arrived at the new Big 8 based on this expert consultation. As I mentioned, sesame was introduced, soy was actually taken out. There were a number of other allergens as well that were identified to be no longer of international or global relevance, but to be considered of regional relevance. And amongst those, essentially, there was a suggestion of lupin, celery. Those were identified. Mustard, for example, was identified of regional relevance and not of global relevance. Now, in terms of the some of the comments that ought to identify some discussion here is, while we are updating this, the section in the Codex text, so essentially this section, section 4.2.1.4, was not amended in a manner that recognizes the fact that the allergy reaction is actually triggered as a result of exposure to the protein fraction of these foods and not to the entirety of the food. In other words, if I take the example of a common food ingredient, such as I'm going to take maltodextrin, for example, which is essentially a sugar extract that could be extracted from wheat. So maltodextrin is a sugar portion of wheat and technically should not actually induce an allergic reaction. So if maltodextrin is there, an allergic consumer can consume this product. An allergic consumer to wheat would not have the reaction. So the idea is we need to make sure that the Codex text recognizes that the mandatory labeling requirement should apply when there is a risk for allergic consumers. And we know that the risk is really based on the presence of the protein fraction. So essentially here, one of the considerations that wasn't discussed and that I'm bringing forward here is that we recognize that what we have is that the trigger of the mandatory declaration, sorry, I moved too quickly here. The trigger of the mandatory declaration ought to be the presence of the protein fraction of these foods and ingredients when they are present. The second element also that the text did not account for when it was updated, that this section 4.2.1.4 is related to the presence of these ingredients when they are deliberately added to the composition of the food and not as a result of an unintended presence, because unintended presence is in fact covered by the other text that is related to the precautionary allergen labeling. And unfortunately, at this point, the proposed update did not take into account this element. So in fact, this is where our expert team is in fact suggesting that in the discussion that is to be taking place, we need perhaps to factor in these changes in that section 4.2.1.4. And there is in fact a suggestion here that is made for that amendment to say that the following foods and ingredients are known to cause hypersensitivity, food allergy, or celiac disease when any protein fraction of these foods and ingredients is present as a result of deliberate addition to the food or to the food composition, and shall, as a result of such presence, always be declared using the name specified. The portion that is in red here is our proposed change. The portion that is in black is the way the text as it stands right now. Now, we understand, in fact, that as part of the discussion that is taking place, there is a discussion that is happening about a process to grant exemptions for foods that might contain, so prepackaged food that might contain these foods of relevance, so essentially these big 8, and where essentially we identify that the fraction of that food is not of a nature that would induce an allergic reaction. In other words, for example, you have oils, for example, I don't know, peanut oil or, an almond oil. But if it is refined, basically that oil may not require necessarily the declaration of a mandatory declaration because it is refined. Now, making this change with the introduction of the protein notion would lead to a lesser reliance on this exemption process, because essentially the exemption process would still be useful, but only to ensure that the processes that are being used to produce these foods are such that they exclude the totality of the protein fraction. So in other words, if we have oils, we really excluded all the non-fat portions. So all the protein portion was out. If we are having sugars, we also have an extraction and a purification process that excluded everything else. So if we don't introduce the protein portion, basically we will have to have an exemption system every time that you have the non-protein, portion that is used in the food process. So essentially here, we would be introducing, if you will, a more robust requirement of mandatory declaration, where the exemption process is triggered only when you have a doubt on the process, but not necessarily every time when you don't have the protein fraction. So I'll pause here for a second to see your reaction on this, because this is pretty fundamental, because frankly, this section 4.2.1.4 is really the heart of the allergen declaration provision in the general standard for labeling of prepackaged foods. If there are no comments, I can continue, but I just wanted to make sure that I don't overwhelm with information. But also, if you have questions, and if I'm going too fast as well, or if there are any clarification that you might be seeking on this. Okay. I guess I'm gonna interpret silence as agreement or as understanding, if you allow me to do so. Hopefully it's not the reverse, that silence means confusion and not understanding. Hopefully that's not the case. Okay.
I go start.
Yes, please.
Can you please repeat the part that you say about the exemption?
Okay.
Again? Maybe
Sure.
a lot of information to process. So when you introduce the rate clauses in here in rate, and that means we may not need the exemption criteria. Is that right?
No, it's not that we may need them. We may not need them. I think we still need them, but if we introduce the text in this fashion, we will rely on them less. Basically, we will rely on them only in situations where we want to ascertain that the process to produce an ingredient where the protein is not the main element of that ingredient, that the process indeed removes very well the protein fraction. Whereas if we don't actually list in the standard this notion of protein, every time you have a non-protein element of that ingredient, to make sure that the allergen mandatory declaration does not get triggered, you need to have the exemption process being triggered. So you see, by making the standard be more precise as to what fraction of the food that triggers the mandatory declaration, we will be using the exemption process, but with, I would say, more targeted and more focused approach. It will be simply to ascertain that a process indeed removes, the unwanted fraction, okay? In other words, if an industry produces an oil fraction in a manner that is, a refined oil, or basically we know that it's distilled, it's basically we know that proteins generally don't evaporate, so at least at the same level as the other portions. Basically, the producer of that doesn't have to ask for an exemption, because you know that you're producing a refined oil. So if you are producing a refined oil, you don't need to declare that in a mandatory way in your list of ingredients, like based on this, and you don't need to rely on the exemption process. You will rely on the exemption process simply in situations where we're not sure of the process.
That's clear. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, really, and thank you, colleagues from Thailand, for raising that. It's not to negate the usefulness of the exemption process, but essentially it will make less regulatory burden. So essentially, if a country decides to adopt this Codex standard and to put it in their national regulations, the application of the standard in the national regulations will result in a less burdensome approach of its application, because industry will not have to apply every time for an exemption, every time that you have a non-protein fraction being included in the food, in order to say, well, I don't need to declare this in a mandatory fashion. So if that's clear, we would move now to the discussion related to the allergen of regional relevance. Now, in this part, I think actually we saw an improvement in the standard, where the standard is no longer identifying only big 8s, but also suggests other ingredients that essentially could be of regional relevance. And amongst the ingredients, for example, for Asia, buckwheat is an ingredient that is known potentially to be related to allergic reactions more prevalent in the Asia region than they are in other parts of the world. So essentially, this list is updated, but when you look at the list contains far more, ingredients related to Europe and North America. So you have mustard there, you have celery, you have lupin. So those are amongst the allergen of regional relevance. Now, what we found when we analyzed the way the text was basically written, we found that the text was written in such a way that it says that the only, or it implied that the only ingredients of regional relevance are those that are listed in the text. Whereas what we wanted to make sure is that the text introduces enough flexibility such that if a national or regional jurisdiction identified another ingredient that may be of regional relevance and that is identified according to a risk assessment that follows the criteria, which we indicated: prevalence, so regional prevalence, potency, and severity, basically there is the possibility to do so, and the possibility of identifying that one as an ingredient of regional relevance. So here we have a comment that we may need maybe to tweak the wording, because the wording right now, as it stands, it says, and I didn't really copy it here, but it is present in the document. It says, in addition to the foods and ingredients listed in section 4.2.1.4, national or regional authorities may also require declaration of any of the following foods and ingredients. So because it says any of the following foods and ingredients, basically it's restrictive to those that are listed. So we want to make sure that it is not restrictive and that there isn't an overinterpretation that the text says it's only those that may have regional relevance, and that basically it gives the opportunity for countries or for regions to consider other ingredients as long as they are supported by a risk assessment. So that's another comment that we put, and this is in relation to this bullet point about discussion of food allergens of regional relevance. Now, I guess now with that, we're going to be delving into the second part of the discussion, which is quite interesting, and that's really the discussion on the guidelines for the use of precautionary allergen labeling.
Just before that, Prof, when you said that in 4.2.15, it does not, the current text does not allow national authorities to add an ingredient like, for example, buckwheat that you mentioned. What is the proposed text that your group has got now? Did you put in the...
Yeah, here we did not put a proposed text, but we can propose, basically we put it as more as a consideration. Basically, as a consideration, we put a general statement where we said, Other foods beyond those included in the list recommended for regional relevance could be considered for addition, requiring mandatory labeling based on a risk assessment by national or regional jurisdictions that uses the criteria of national or regional prevalence, severity of the reaction induced, and or potency. So in fact, actually, maybe here also for reference, our organization, so essentially IOFOST and GForce, will be introducing a CRD where we will be actually making really more pointed proposals of text. So we're hoping to introduce this during the course of this week, so that in the form of a CRD. So here, indeed, we did not put basically a proposed text specifically for this consideration.
Okay, maybe we could look out for the CRD.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. T. Now, moving on to the precautionary labeling item, and this is really now a great progress was identified. In fact, in the way this document has evolved. So clearly, there is clear support the fact that precautionary allergen labeling are to be used as a result of a risk assessment, and this is really a major development. However, here we have another element of discussion, because the way the text is developed, the text is developed in order to address this issue of overuse of allergen precautionary statements. And as it stands, the text says, and here I'm going to read basically the totality of the text before we go in entirety. I mean, in fact, actually here, maybe it might be useful to share with you another document, maybe to use the PDF document that was shared with you earlier. It might be useful to follow on that one so that everybody can see essentially the comments that we are making on this. And I hope I'm not making it too detailed, but unfortunately, I mean, this item requires that level of detail. It's quite technical in nature. So this is in relation to now the review of Appendix 3 and the guidelines related on the use of precautionary allergen labeling. Now, what we found was that the way essentially the text has been developed is that it clearly addresses the notion that allergen labeling or precautionary allergen labeling is to be restricted to situations where we have unintended presence of an allergen. And when there is essentially the situation cannot be sufficiently controlled using allergen management practices. Now, it's really great to see how the text was proposed. And this is the text that was proposed. So this is the text that is right now put in principle 4.1 of that guidance. It says, effective management practices and controls to prevent or minimize the unintended presence of allergens caused by cross-contact shall be implemented as outlined in the Code of Practice on Allergen Management for Food Business Operators. The use of PAL shall be restricted to those situations in which the unintended presence of an allergen cannot be sufficiently controlled using these allergen management practices. And then it goes on later on and it warrants a risk assessment to support the reliance on these statements. Where we find that this is lacking guidance, it is lacking guidance because it does not go as far as to mandate the use of precautionary labeling when essentially these situations of uncontrolled cross-contact happen. And in fact, when we look at the situation around the world right now, we have a patchwork of regulatory frameworks where some countries, when they find an allergen that is covered by this provision, meaning it's unintended and it's present. So it means that it's not controlled. And when they don't find a precautionary allergen labeling, there is a recall that is triggered. Other countries do nothing. So essentially, there is an unpredictability to the industry about that. And what we find is that there is an inconsistency between Principle 4.1 as it is listed here and the provision of allergen labeling in the other text, in the general standard for labeling of prepackaged foods, when it talks about allergens. So essentially here, we have a discussion point where we're saying is that we should go all the way to have the guideline require the mandatory declaration of the ingredients using PAL when we have a situation of uncontrolled, unintended presence of allergens. And that right now is not present in the text. The text actually right now frames how PAL should be used. Basically, we're saying PAL could not be used unless you have a risk assessment, but it does not say that when you have an uncontrolled presence that is of an unintended nature, it warrants a declaration using PAL. So this is our proposed wording, in fact, to introduce this. So basically, we're completing this sentence with the addition of when such situations are met, the mandatory declaration of the foods and the ingredients warranted by section 4.2.1.4. And you remember we amended we suggested the amendment of 4.2.1.4 now to mention this, that this was deliberate. So here we're dealing with the other case. And the other case is the unintended, uncontrolled. So we're saying when such situations are met, the mandatory declaration of the foods and ingredients warranted by section 4.2.1.4 of the general standard of labeling of prepackaged food shall apply. So it applies as a mandatory declaration, but now it should be using a precautionary allergen labeling instead of an ingredient declaration. The same would apply for food and ingredients identified in section 4.2.1.4 where relevant. And this, sorry, here 0.5, there's a typo, it's 0.5. And this is for the regional ingredients. So you see, this is for the global, big 8. This is for the regional ingredients. So by doing this, we are creating more consistency. Mandatory declaration when you have deliberate addition of ingredients, and actually we're defining when it's protein, and we're putting really the condition that that's a priority allergen labeling declaration of ingredients. When you have a situation that is unintended and controlled, you trigger a mandatory declaration, but in the form of PAL, of precautionary allergen labeling. But then the text actually goes and is more directive as to how this is done or what are the parameters to do so. We would not be doing this without basing this on a risk assessment. So essentially, and this is in fact identified in the remainder of the principles. In the remainder of the principles, it says that it needs to be supported by a risk assessment. So you see, this is actually one of the elements that we consider to be key to improve the way this text is being proposed. Now, if we continue our discussion around that, one of the other elements that we identified is that the text may be too directive and perhaps imposing something on jurisdictions that they may not be ready to accept. And I'm going to share this in a minute, because basically right now, the text really mentions that PAL cannot be used unless it is the result of a risk assessment, which is absolutely the recommendation of the expert consultation. The expert consultation provided reference doses but the expert consultation provided reference doses on the basis of what we call ED5. What are the ED5? ED5s are essentially the dose of an allergen that triggers a reaction in 5% of the population based on the clinical studies that were available to the expert group. Now, the text as it is written right now in Principle 4.2, it says, PAL shall only be used if the presence of a protein from an allergen is equal to or above an action level. And an action level here is mentioned in a footnote. Basically, it's the milligram of a total protein that's essentially the action level, but it is a reference dose divided by the amount of the food, which is, by the way, the right, the right formula. But in the way the text is written right now, it imposes that the reference doses are the doses that are listed in 4.3.1, which is essentially the ED5 derived doses. Our analysis has led to the fact that deciding that is actually a stretch for some countries, because we are saying that for all countries of the world, your level of protection should not exceed 95% of the population. Basically, what you're saying is that you need to look at only the ED5, that's your dose of reference. And we consider that this is not necessarily something that will have a global relevance. And we need to make sure that we have enough flexibility. Plus, the doses as they are listed, they are based on evidence that was reviewed by the expert consultation. And we know that that evidence moves, because tomorrow we might have more clinical information that changes, and we cannot wait for another expert consultation in order to update that. So here, what we are suggesting is to introduce more flexibility, and this is our wording. The reference dose may be chosen from the listed reference dose values in 4.3.1 or be developed by national jurisdictions based on their own risk assessments. Right now, the text is not saying that. The text is saying it shall be the values of in 4.3.1. So it's very directive, it's restrictive to that. We're saying this may be too much of a stretch. We do not want to lessen the value of the reference doses as they are proposed, but we want to introduce flexibility, and we want to use this notion of maybe chosen from the listed reference or be developed by national jurisdictions based on risk assessments. And here we want to introduce basically a requirement. When that is done by national jurisdiction based on the risk assessment, we say, should the reference dose chosen by a given competent authority be different from the listed values in 4.3.1, it would need to be disclosed and made available to industry and consumers with the relevant justification, and the relevant justification being a risk assessment. So this is our proposal. I guess for us, this is really a key consideration, because we consider that imposing on the world that the ED5 is the only way to protect consumers with allergies ignores the fact that sensitivity to allergens may be variable from one region to the other, from one population to the other, and also that countries and competent authorities may want to apply their own level of protection in deriving these doses. This is for us really a fundamental item, so that's why I wanted to have maybe a pause there. And maybe to finish here, I can actually finish here on a couple of other considerations to look at in the discussion. Right now, the text, when they mention the obligation to rely on a risk assessment, they tend to mention that this should be only a quantitative risk assessment. We consider that this might be too much of a burden on industry, and particularly on the SMEs. And perhaps here that we can mention both qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. The main advance or the main progress that we want to achieve here is that precautionary allergen labeling is no longer applied on the label without justification. Meaning that we should not having what we call, somebody say may contain and the entire list without thinking why they are applying that may contain statement. And finally, we're also saying that it's great that the text or essentially the discussion has led to the real identification that we need to look at allergen methods, because if we are to apply risk assessments, we need to make sure that we're relying on analytical methods that are valid, and asking guidance from CCMAS in that regard is great. But I think we need also to ask guidance on sampling plans as well in relation with the unintended presence of allergens that might warrant the reliance on precautionary allergen labeling. So this is really our analysis of this text. And I guess our conclusion on this is that this text has indeed made significant progress, and it is really ought to be highlighted. We would advocate that the items that are subject to discussion can be resolved, hopefully during the plenary and even during the working group discussions. And I would say that there is a high expectation from allergic consumers right now that this text moves, because it will really create a leap in the way allergic consumers are to be protected. It will create a leap in two ways. It will avoid situations of over-labeling, and it will create more convergence, if not even harmonization, in the way precautionary allergen labeling are to be administered. This concludes really our analysis of this item. And believe me, this is the biggest part of our analysis, because the other items, their analysis is much lighter. I'll pause there now and maybe open up this for discussion. And apologies if I took quite a bit of time on this one.
I think it's a very important discussion and justifies your time and clear explanation on your proposal. So we welcome any comments or reaction or views from participants online.
I hope it was clear and it was not overwhelming.
Well, you explain slowly. Yeah. Anyone want to comment on these proposals? This is from the GFORCE group, right? You're experts in the GFORCE, yeah?
That is correct. Well, if there are no comments, then I guess we will continue for the interest of time. And for the interest of time, basically, the other items that we identified worthy of discussions are, and I hope you are seeing my slides. Yes, you are able to see the slides?
Maybe just Prof. Samuel, just one point to share with participants is that yesterday Pauline sent out some documents, and one document was mentioned by Prof. Samuel, and that is, so the documents included country comments on this agenda item 5. So you could look through all those country comments, and it's quite a headache to go through all that. Yeah, but the chair has been an analysis. The chair has been an analysis, and is present in document called CCCF17 VWG Allergen Summary Responses. So the chair did make some effort to summarize the main comments. And when I looked through the comments from the countries, I did see some comments from the region, from the ASEAN countries. And for example, I think Thailand and Indonesia commented on sesame, I think sesame seed, and would suggest that that be not be in 4.4214, not in the mandatory list, the big 8, and be moved to 4215. So that was what I picked up from the comments. There's also comment on oats, and then it may not require, and then it's now in 4214. Yeah, the prefer is in 4214 now. So we have been consuming sesame for a long time, and oats, and also of course soya. Soya is now in 4214. So but I also see some comments from countries not agreeing to that, moving soya to 4214. So there could be some discussions on that. And so this is where it becomes more interesting, yeah, as we go into specific items in the two main lists. What were the other? I think these were the main thing I picked up comments from the ASEAN countries. Yeah.
Yes. Perhaps actually I could
Yeah.
add, Dr. T, that in fact here, because I did not really mention all the comments as well that we made, in fact, we concur with one notion that oats should be even removed from 4.1.2.5, simply because oats is not a question of regional relevance. Oats is there in relation with celiac disease. The only concern related to oats is essentially a cross-contamination with wheat, spelt, rye, etc. So oats, based on the scientific evidence that has become available, meaning avenines, which are essentially the gluten in oats, they are avenines. Avenines are not toxic to celiac individuals. So essentially, we are of the opinion that oats should be removed altogether from the regional list. On the other hand, we understand the statement about sesame. However, based on the way the expert consultation looked at sesame, they found that the prevalence data is of global relevance and not of regional relevance. So as a result, basically sesame fit the criteria of being in the big 8 because there was data of global relevance, the severity is there, the potency is there.
I see. Yeah. Okay. And also you commented about using qualitative as well as quantitative. The way it's worded now, it says quantitative, but not limited to quantitative. It's the other way around, yeah?
Exactly.
So we would have said, yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, we would advocate to introduce another way to say both qualitative and quantitative. Basically, what we are advocating through this guidance is that precautionary allergen labeling should not be applied on a label without thinking and without doing some controls. So essentially, it starts with doing all the controls, seeing that the controls do not remove the likelihood of the presence, so it becomes unintended presence. Then we conduct an assessment. The assessment doesn't have to be quantitative, it can be qualitative. And if the assessment leads that the probability of exclusion of the allergen cannot be ascertained, then a precautionary allergen labeling becomes warranted. So this is what we are advocating. And in fact, here I'm using this as an opportunity, Dr. T, to indicate that our group is organizing a side event on Wednesday at lunchtime. And it's going to be both in presence, but it's going to be broadcast as well through a webinar system, where we are proposing. We did, in fact, our team did, in fact, a study on guidance for allergen management that supports the way precautionary allergen labeling ought to be applied. That guidance is publicly available. And we will be presenting essentially the resources that we developed as part of this. So I invite everybody to join us. For those who are present in person, we will be providing lunch as well. So you don't need to plan for that day.
So those on virtual will miss a lunch.
Those who are on virtual, unfortunately, we're going to miss you.
Pack your own lunch. Yeah? So, okay, any comments from any participants online? Yeah, looks like not. And maybe Prof, you can proceed with the, yes, Miss, yeah. Mr. King, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Godfrey, for sharing all these very technical insights with us. I think it's very helpful. We will bring it back to discuss with our scientists and also consult MOH on some of these aspects. And I would also like to thank Dr. T for highlighting Thailand's input about sesame, just sharing some of the observations that we have from pediatricians. As many other Asian countries, we also think that we have been pursuing sesames, for very long, and it shouldn't be an allergen for this area. But surprisingly, the pediatrician is sharing with us that increasingly they observe more and more allergen cases for sesame among the children. So so this is something that we didn't expect as well. Unfortunately, MOH Singapore doesn't capture data on allergen and all these cases. But through conversation with the pediatrician, so we have some of these surprising findings, which we thought we can share with countries of this region. Maybe they can also talk to the doctors and pediatricians in their countries to find out more on the prevalence of sesame, especially among children.
Interesting.
Good point. So the country CCPs can quickly check with some specialists on this and see whether there's some prevalence. We cannot afford to be careless on this. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Yeah. Okay, that's good.